All right, welcome everybody. This is going to be a quick video on how to use a software called Klayout. And Klayout is specifically good for making two-dimensional CAD files. And this is really important for any sort of micromachining or lithography, but it's equally useful for things like laser cutting or two-dimensional CNC routing. So we'll dig in. The first thing you want to do is open up Klayout. So Klayout comes with actually two programs. It has a viewer and an editor. The viewer can just open files. The editor is what we're going to want to use. So we're going to open the editor. And what we're immediately sort of presented with is a pretty simple panel. There's not much going on here. And what we need to do is there are three basic components to Klayout. There is a layout in Klayout. There's a cell, and there's a layer. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new layout. We go to File, New Layout. And this is really our workspace. This is sort of like defining a piece of paper in Microsoft Word, like the dimensions and the margins and things like that. So the first thing we want to do is we have to define a top cell. Let's call it simple. We'll understand simple or test. We'll see why that is in a minute. We're going to choose the database unit. So right now it's 1 nanometer. Everything is sort of in microns. And the initial window size will do a millimeter, so 1,000 microns. Okay, so now we sort of have a blank workspace. If we kind of look around, we have a couple tools up in the top left. There's added menus up in the upper left. This is Mac, but everything is going to look just the same on Windows. Okay, so now we have a Navigator, which it's not clear what that does yet, and cells, a list of cells, which I'm going to get to in a second, and then layers on the far right, and maybe some options for the layers. So if we just tried to make a box right now, we wouldn't have a layer to actually make the box in. So what we have to do is we have to go to File, or Edit, Layer, New Layer. We're going to call this layer something, and it turns out that layers are essentially the materials that you're going to be using. That's sort of the simplest way to do it. So you can have multiple layers, and you can choose to etch or ablate them in different ways, but that's sort of the general unit. You have to click on it to highlight it in order to use the layer. And now what you're doing is we already have a cell, which was formed when we defined the panel or the layout. And this cell is really our diagram of what we want to make. And this layer is where that cell is going to go. So if we just want to make the simplest sort of thing, like a box, we can just make a box like that. Okay, we made a box. Now we want to be able to edit it sort of at the micron scale, and we might want to add features to the box like cuts or additions or holes or maybe, all sorts of things. So let's go over the tools really quickly. What do we have at our disposal? The first tool is Select. So we can select an object and it highlights it in a black border. We can move selected objects just by clicking on them and then moving them. We can measure things, and this is actually quite nice. You can measure things in microns right now, and then if you hold Shift, it actually forces it to move along the Cartesian directions, which is quite nice. So right now we can actually just measure. It snaps a little bit, so we can measure what this box is. This box is about 647 microns. Hitting Escape always brings you back to Select. And then I can select any object and just hit delete and it gets rid of it. So I just deleted the ruler in that case. This add button is to merge objects or to modify objects together. The polygon button does something that you would kind of expect. I can just draw polygons inside of my cells. The box we've just shown, text isn't too useful. The path bar actually allows you to just define points in your surface, and they have a certain width that you can define. So in this case, it'll be 100 microns. We can choose sort of the edge types, which is fun to play with, and then we can just draw sort of a path, and it makes a channel for us, whatever that channel might be. The instance toolbar is quite interesting because you can take. Okay, I'm going to zoom out using the scroll bar. The scroll bar is very useful for this program. So I can select an object, and then I can create an instance of it. And what it likes to do is actually likes to create instances of whole cells. Unfortunately, this is one of the very tricky things about this program, is that it uses up that cell when it makes an instance of it. So it's actually not quite ideal. So I'm not going to worry about that for now, but maybe I'll make a future video about that. Okay, so I've just drawn things, but as we all know, it's not too precise to make things using just the mouse. So what we'd like to do is be able to edit something about these shapes. And Klayout, and in fact all editors of this type, only define the vertices, and then they connect them with lines. So actually the only data in this sort of image right now is the vertices of the individual objects we've made. So if I double click any object, it'll actually give me all the vertices. And so while these look a little annoying and very precise, I can edit them individually, and I can actually get rid of whole points. And so what's also nice, if we see in this bottom right corner, it actually gives the position in microns relative to the center of the coordinates. So if I wanted to find this point, minus 63, minus 311, I would actually just look to the bottom left until I can get, okay, minus 63, let's do that, and then minus 311, it's this point. So if I delete that point, it'll still close the object. Let me get rid of that space. When I apply it, it just reduced that object. And then I can also move these around. Let's say I wanted to round everything up, or nearest near integer, 450, and let's just do 125, 500, 300. And what we'll see is that everything will shift slightly, which is fine. And so now I can actually change the coordinates of each of these points very easily. Okay, so that's fine for polygons. That's quite nice. I'm going to move it out of the workspace right now. Similarly, I'm going to move the path away from the box because I want to focus on the box. The box is really interesting because you actually only need 2 coordinates to define the box because of these 90-degree angles. You only need the upper left corner and the bottom right corner, or sort of the center point and the width and the length. And so it turns out if we click on it, it'll already know to do this. So the box is one of the special objects, and this makes it really, really easy to control. The upper left and upper right corners are usually not as easy to control as changing the center coordinates. Let's say I want to center it on 0, 0. And then I can change the width. Let's say I wanted a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter box. Just type in 1000, 1000. When I apply it, it's all centered up. And the corners have automatically sort of filled themselves in. This is an extremely useful feature. I usually build everything out of boxes as much as possible, simply for this feature. And let's say I wanted, a rectangle instead. I can just change the width. Let's say I want to change it to a skinny, long rectangle. Ooh, let's do 100. And I have it. So that's quite nice. Now, these objects are quite nice, and you can copy and paste them. So on Mac, it's Control-C. It'll turn red once it's been copied. It's no longer selected. And then when I press Command-V, when I press Command-V, it should move it. Oh, Command-Z always undoes the option. Huh. Well, it works through the edit menu. I'm not sure. I must have my shortcut keys a little bit backwards. Anyway, it usually pastes it to the same place that you just copied it from. And then you can move it around a little bit. Okay, so that's fine. It's easy to make boxes now. Similarly, I can edit this path object, which is also a really nice, useful one. So I can double click it, and now there's one free parameter, the width, and then all of the points associated with that path. So I can get rid of a point, and it will correct itself and draw straight lines. So these are the basic objects, which is quite nice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete everything. Let's say I wanted to make something very simple, like the outline of a vapor cell. So let's do that really quickly. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a box for the outline of the cell, roughly. I'm going to hit Escape to go into select mode. Double-click the box. Now I have all of its coordinates. I'm going to center it at 0, 0. The width is something like 14,000 or 14 millimeters by 9 millimeters, so 9,000 microns. And then I'm going to zoom out with the scroll wheel on the mouse. And if I click the scroll wheel, it allows me to move, which is quite nice. And now I want to start cutting some things out of the box. And this is sort of new, so let's talk about what we're going to do. First, we need the two objects that we want to cut from each other. Let's just say I'm going to make something that has two channels, or two cutouts with sort of channels in between. So once I kind of hover over the object, it knows which one to sort of pick based on which one you're inside of. So I can double click this box, and let's say I want to again make it, I want to center it at least in the Y coordinate, and I want to round this up. So maybe I'll go to -2 millimeters. And then the width I will make 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing over here, only I'm going to move it over the other direction. So it's going to be down, or it's going to be centered on the y-axis, and then over 2 millimeters with box edges of 3 millimeters. Okay, so now we sort of have what we need. What we want to do, though, is cut this box out of that box. In order to do that, I'm going to use this edit menu. So this edit menu actually contains most of the useful tools in this program. And so we have layout, everything that you could do to the layout. I rarely use this one. Cell, this is how you make new cells, or can change the cell a little bit. Layer, this is how you make new layers, and so forth. And then selection is the most useful tool in this whole program. So what does it do? It says you have made a selection somewhere, and you want to modify that selection somehow. So there are obvious things like transformations, such as flips or rotations or scalings, or also the very useful move by or move to. So the move to, you just put in the coordinates of the object, of where you want the object to be centered at. Move by just moves the object by a fixed amount. So let's do that. Let's say I want to move, this inner box by 1 millimeter to the left. So I go to Edit, Selection, Move by, and then in the X direction, I just want to move by 1 millimeter. Now they're overlapped. I want to undo that now, so I just press Command Z. Pretty simple stuff. Okay, so now if you want to do something a little bit more complicated, what you can do is you can actually change the layer. Let's say you have a silicon mask and maybe a gold mask or something. Then you can change the object, the cell object, to a different layer if you need to. You can round the corners. This is how you actually make circles. I'll get into that in a minute. And then these are the three most important ones. So it's merge shapes, intersection, and subtraction. And in fact, the most important ones are really merge and subtraction. And you can see that merge doesn't matter the order in which you click them, but subtraction does. So it's others from the first. So the object which you want to be subtracted from, you have to click first. So I can actually click the object I want to cut from, and then what's interesting about this program, it's a little funny, is that the Shift button allows you to select multiple objects. So if I just clicked right now, it would switch to this object. But if I want to select both at the same time, I have to hold Shift and click. And then, now that I've done that in that order, I'm going to go to Selection, Subtraction, Others from First. And that's it. That's how you make a cut. And you see that something's changed about the object a little bit, and this is based on the file type that this program makes. So GDS files or DXF files, all these files, they don't actually allow for you to have objects which sort of have a hole cut out of the middle of them. So what they require is sort of closed paths. And so that's what you see here. There's this long rectangle that sort of wraps up on itself. And it needs to create that. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click this outer object, which is now combined. I can actually move it around with the cut inside of it. That's just fine. I'm going to Command Z, put it back in place. Now I select this outer object because I want to cut out of it this smaller circle, or smaller square, excuse me. I'm going to subtract it, and there I have it. So I have two holes cut out of this box, and maybe I want to make some channels between these holes. So what I can go is I can go to the path. Maybe I want them to be 50 microns wide. And what I'm going to just draw are some freehand, they're pretty narrow actually. So I have some freehand things here. Oh, and I clicked too many times, so I'm going to hit escape, so I'm going to go to select. I'm going to double click the object, and I see that I actually drew 4 points. But just looking at the numbers, it's pretty obvious that these 2 points are quite close to each other. So I can just erase this point, and it cleaned up that little edge. And maybe I'm not very happy with sort of the thickness of this path, so I'm going to increase it to 150 microns. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now the coordinates are a little funky, and I could go through and sort of adjust them individually, but that's sort of easy to do, and I'm not going to waste any time doing that. Instead, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make a couple of these. So let's say I'm going to take this object, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it, and now it's zoomed in, so it worked this time for whatever reason, but it zoomed in on exactly where the object was copied. And now if we look up to this upper left, this is the Navigator. The Navigator is looking at my whole cell, wherever there's material, and it allows me to kind of quickly zoom around it as I'd like. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit using the scroll wheel. And now I actually have two objects here, and they're overlaid. So I can move this other one a little bit lower. And then to make my job a little bit easier, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Shift and select both of these objects, and then copy them and paste them. And it still has both selected, so I can actually move both of these together. Alright, so now they're still selected, and maybe what I want to do is actually rotate these by 90 degrees so that I have sort of them flipped around. So I can do that quite easily. So I say Edit, Selection, Rotate, let's see, or let's just flip it vertically. And I'm going to move it a little bit more. Alright, that looks pretty nice. Now what I'd like to do is, again, subtract these channels from the vapor cell, or this is a vapor cell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select now the first outer object, and now every other object that I select after this will be subtracted from it. I'm going to hold Shift and select these 4 paths. Go up to Edit, Selection, Subtraction, Others from First. And there you have it. That's sort of the basics of how to use this program. Let's say I wanted to make something a little bit more exotic. Let's say a circle. So circles, because this program works with vertices, it necessarily can't create a perfectly round circle, but you can increase the number of the number of sides of a polygon until it quite closely approximates that circle. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to draw a box. Oop, I didn't select a layer. Got to remember to do that. Okay, so I have a box. I'm going to double click it. I'm going to just adjust its coordinates very quickly. I'm going to make it 6 millimeters tall by 6 millimeters wide. And what I'm going to do is I want a circle with a diameter of 6 millimeters. So I go into Edit, Selection, Round Corners. And now, ignoring this inner quarter radius, we're going to say the outer corner radius is just the radius of the circle we want to make, which is 3 millimeters, 3,000 microns. And the number of points for a full circle, so we're just going to say 100. That should be enough. And now we have something that looks just like a circle to us, but it's actually composed of straight line segments. I can do things with each of these coordinates as well. So now it's actually just an object with tons of coordinates. And I can find individual points, and maybe I just want to edit one of these. Let's say I want to throw this one really far down, so I'm going to say minus 9,000. And what it just did was it just moved that point, but it kept the points that it was connected to. And this is just another object. So that's how you make boxes. That's how you cut out of the boxes. This is how you use paths to cut out of objects. You can also add to objects as well. So let's say I wanted to add this circular object to this larger object. It turns out it's just like subtracting. I take the two objects I'd like to merge, go to Edit, Selection, Merge the Shapes, and there you have it. And now, if I double click this, it has all these points. You're just going to have to trust me on this, but all of these points and all of these points are now in this single shape. Okay, so that's sort of the rough outline. I think, oh yeah, okay, so let's talk about this for a second. We also have this tiny little thing that sometimes is really confusing, levels on the bottom left. And so there's no need to describe this, just try to, if you can't see something when you open up a file, just increase this a bunch. That's sort of the main thing. Okay, let's say I wanted to make another object. Maybe I wanted a different layer. So let's add a layer. Go to Edit, New Layer. We'll call this one Gold. And what we have to do is give it a number. It's a different number. This is for the robots that manufacture these things. So I'm going to give it 2. And now I see that it's shown up in layers and it's purple. I can change all of these if I'd like. I can change it to green and so forth. And if I double click one, it actually hides that layer. So this is useful for working on things at the same time and maybe aligning different mask steps to sort of similar objects, but you don't want those objects to appear in the other mask. So that's exactly what this is useful for. So I can turn that one off, and I can keep the gold one on. Let's color it orange for a moment. And what I'd like to do is, let's say I wanted to make a wafer, just a template for a wafer. Well, I have this rectangle. A wafer is something like, a 4-inch wafer, I think, is something like 101 millimeters in diameter, which is something like 50.8 millimeters in radius. So let's do that. Let's center it first. It's always nice to center everything because then you know exactly where it is. And it's going to be 101,000 microns. And 101,000 microns there. I'm going to zoom out using the scroll wheel. I'm going to center it by clicking the scroll wheel and dragging a little bit. Okay, and now I'm going to go in and I'm just going to round the corners again. The outer corner radius is something like 50,500 microns. And there you go. So this is roughly what the wafer would be. And let's say I wanted to put maybe some marks at plus and minus 40 millimeters. So I'm going to just draw some objects. These could be anything. But again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to center it. I want it to be along the y-axis. Maybe it'll have dimensions of 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters. And then the x coordinate for the center should be at 40 millimeters. Instead of doing that again there, what I can actually just do is I can click that, copy it, paste it, double click it, and just move it over to plus 40 millimeters. And there you go, you have it. And so now I have maybe a part in silicon and then a part in gold. and I can hide these different layers individually. The last thing is I'm going to talk about instances. So what I can do is I can create a new cell. The cells, let's call it let's call it dinosaur. So this dinosaur thing, whatever it may be, is currently highlighted. It might be a little difficult to see with the font size, but or bolded. So this is the active view. Whatever I have highlighted in the cells is what's going to show up here. So let's say I wanted to show the test. What I have to do is I have to right-click it, and then I say Show as New Top. And then I have my object again. If I want to see the dinosaur thing, then I'll say Show as New Top. So now I have this other cell, and I have to click which layer I want to put it on. But I can create maybe, nope, you know what? I'm going to create a path, 50 microns, and it'll be, I was so zoomed in. Okay, I'm going to zoom out about a bunch. Okay, so I'm going to create a path, 50 microns. Okay, it's a fine path. I can move it around. I can do whatever I need to it. All right. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go back to test, and I want to make a bunch of copies of this on that wafer, whatever that thing might be. So I'm going to show that as the new top, and then I'm going to click this instance button. And now it says you have to choose a cell. This is probably the most complicated part of Klayout, but it's useful to go through because then you'll know what's happening. So I'm going to choose dinosaur. That's the cell I want to create a bunch of copies of. And what I can do is I can specify the number of rows and the number of columns and sort of these row vectors and column vectors. And so what this means is I can actually, in this case, I'm just creating arrays of these things, but they're spaced by 10 millimeters in the x direction and 10 millimeters in the y direction. So I'll make a 3 by 5 array. So I'll apply that. That's what it looks like, and it turns out it acts just like a stamp now. So you can see that it's a regular array with 3 rows, 5 columns. Okay, but maybe what I want to do is I want that array to not be in a uniform rectangle, but actually sort of in a skewed way. So I can add a little something to these column vectors. Maybe I add 5,000, and it gives it a little slant. I can also rotate these things slightly and really control all the little bits and pieces. I can change the size of these objects as well. Once I have that, it becomes a stamp, and I can stamp it and stamp it again. Okay, so once I'm done stamping, I just hit escape. And the first thing that you'll see is that all of these little dinosaur boxes, I can't see the actual structures in them. And the reason for that is this levels thing. So if I keep increasing this number, it displays all those objects. If I go down, so there's only one level here, but if I go to 0 levels, it just draws the whole thing with just some name. It does this so that it kind of cuts down on the memory consumption, because if you're trying to display millions upon millions of points, it slows down your computer. But we're not really operating in that regime right now. So that's how you make all of these things, and that's about it. And then you can save your masterpiece however you'd like, and you can save it as, let's just call it Wafer Example. Save it to the desktop, and then you can choose the layout file that you'd like. So it has GDS2 files, these are very common, and DXF files. So GDS2 files, I'm just going to save it like that. I'm going to save, and then it gives me sort of the features of the GDS file. So I can change the database unit, I can change the scaling, and so forth. Once I'm happy with everything, I just hit OK. Now, I should find it. Let's see. It's right here. So this is that little file that we just made. And that's all there really is to it. Obviously, there are details and there's a lot of shortcuts. But what I'll do is that there's also a very, very nice tutorial on this stuff. Let me just find it, and I'll link to it in the description. Klayout tutorial. And it's actually, yeah, this sounds right. So because this is so useful for microfabrication, there's this tutorial that sort of focuses more on electronics, but the same principles apply. And it's a really good tutorial, and it's very worth going through. And it'll describe sort of the same thing that I just did, and it's just fun to play with.